Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stood on the observation deck of the Nakajima Aircraft Company's main facility in Musashino, just outside Tokyo, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp November air of 1944. At 32, he had dedicated his entire adult life to the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, and now served as a technical liaison between combat units and the engineers who designed their aircraft. The war had not gone as promised. The victories of 1941 and early 1942 seemed like distant memories now, replaced by an endless series of retreats and devastating losses. But nothing had prepared Yamamoto for what he witnessed that morning when the air raid sirens began their mournful wail across the capital. He raised his binoculars toward the southern sky, expecting to see the usual formations of B-24 Liberators or perhaps carrier-based aircraft. Instead, what appeared made his hands tremble slightly as he adjusted the focus. At an altitude he estimated to be impossibly high, a formation of massive four-engine bombers moved across the sky like silver fish swimming through an ocean of blue. Their contrails painted white lines against the heavens, so high that they seemed untouchable, unreachable by any defense Japan possessed. "Sir, those are the new American bombers," said Sergeant Kenji Ishida, a veteran aircraft mechanic who had served beside Yamamoto since the China campaigns. "The B-29 Superfortress. Intelligence reported their first raids from China last summer. But this is different." Yamamoto lowered his binoculars, his engineering mind already calculating the implications. The altitude alone was staggering, perhaps 9,000 meters or higher. At that height, the air was thin and brutally cold, temperatures dropping to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. Japanese interceptors struggled to reach even 7,000 meters with any combat effectiveness, and at these altitudes, their performance degraded catastrophically. The distant thunder of anti-aircraft guns echoed across Tokyo, but Yamamoto knew it was futile. The shells were exploding thousands of meters below the American formation, creating useless black puffs that dissipated harmlessly in the wind. The psychological impact was immediate and crushing. Tokyo, the sacred heart of the empire, was being bombed in broad daylight, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. "How many do you count?" Yamamoto asked, though he had already begun his own tally. "At least 70, possibly more," Ishida replied, his voice carrying an edge of disbelief. "They're bombing the Musashino plant. Our plant." The first explosions began moments later, walking across the industrial district with methodical precision. The building beneath them shuddered with each impact, and through the windows, Yamamoto could see columns of smoke rising from nearby factories. The Americans were targeting aircraft production facilities, and their accuracy from such extreme altitude was unnervingly good. What struck Yamamoto most profoundly was not the destruction itself, but the casual impunity with which it was being delivered. These bombers flew in tight formation, maintaining their course without evasive maneuvers, as though they were on a peacetime training exercise rather than penetrating the most heavily defended airspace in the Japanese Empire. After the raid, Yamamoto made his way through the damaged facility, documenting everything he observed. 3 buildings had suffered direct hits, and fires still burned despite the efforts of emergency crews, but his mind was elsewhere, racing through calculations and comparisons that grew more disturbing with each passing moment. That evening, he met with Colonel Hideaki Tanaka, the senior technical officer for the Tokyo defense sector, in a basement office that had survived the raid. Maps covered every wall, marked with defensive positions, radar installations, and fighter bases, all of which had proven utterly inadequate that morning. "Tell me what you saw, Lieutenant," Tanaka said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. The colonel was 53, a veteran of the Great War who had transitioned from combat to technical intelligence. His gray hair and lined face spoke to decades of service, but his eyes remained sharp. Yamamoto laid out his observations methodically, like an engineer presenting a technical report. "The B-29 operates at altitudes our interceptors cannot effectively reach. Even if they could, the bomber's speed at that altitude, I estimate 400 kilometers per hour or more, makes interception extremely difficult. The aircraft is pressurized, allowing the crew to operate comfortably while our pilots struggle with hypoxia and frostbite. What about the defensive armament? Tanaka asked. Formidable. Intelligence reports indicate 12 or more heavy machine guns, possibly 50 caliber weapons, controlled by a sophisticated remote fire control system. The tail position alone appears capable of engaging attackers from below and behind with devastating effect. Yamamoto paused, choosing his next words carefully. Colonel, this aircraft represents a generation beyond anything we have encountered. It is not simply superior, it is qualitatively different. Tanaka nodded slowly, his expression grave. The Americans call it the Super Fortress. Our pilots who have engaged them from China report that conventional interception tactics are nearly useless. The few aircraft that reached attack altitude found themselves battling oxygen deprivation, engine failure from the cold, and defensive fire from multiple positions simultaneously. Yamamoto pulled out a notebook filled with calculations and sketches. I have been analyzing the implications. If the Americans can maintain operations at 9,000 meters with full bomb loads, while our interceptors struggle to reach 7,000 meters, the mathematics becomes simple and terrible. They can bomb any target in Japan at will, and our defenses become largely symbolic. There must be vulnerabilities, Tanaka insisted, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Certainly. Every aircraft has weaknesses. The B-29's engines are complex and prone to overheating. Intelligence indicates they have suffered many mechanical failures. The aircraft requires massive runways and enormous quantities of fuel. But Colonel, these are engineering challenges the Americans appear to be solving, while our defenses remain fundamentally inadequate to the threat. The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken, but understood. Japan had built its air defense around assumptions that no longer applied. The Americans had changed the rules of engagement, and the Empire had no ready answer. Chapter 2. The Engineer's Dilemma. Over the following weeks, Yamamoto became obsessed with understanding the B-29. He collected every scrap of intelligence, every pilot report, every photograph taken by ground observers. He interviewed survivors from units that had attempted interceptions, listening to their accounts of pursuing silver giants that seemed to float above the reach of Japanese fighters. One pilot, a young lieutenant named Hiroshi Saito, described his experience with haunting precision. I pushed my zero to maximum altitude, sir. My instrument panel showed 7,200 meters, but I could barely breathe. The cold had frozen my gun mechanisms. I could see the bombers above me, perhaps 1,500 meters higher, and I could not reach them. They were so close I could see the individual aircraft, but they might as well have been on the moon. Yamamoto documented everything in detailed reports that made their way up the command chain, each one painting a bleaker picture than the last. The B-29 was not just a better bomber. It was a weapon system that operated in a dimension of warfare Japan could not effectively contest. In December, American intelligence officers would later learn, Yamamoto was assigned to a special task force charged with developing countermeasures. The team included aeronautical engineers, weapons designers, and combat veterans, all gathered in a heavily guarded facility in the mountains west of Tokyo. The sessions were brutally honest. Major Ichiro Tanaka, a weapons development specialist, presented calculations showing that Japan's standard 57mm anti-aircraft guns could not reach the B-29's operating altitude with sufficient accuracy or explosive power. We would need 88mm weapons, similar to what the Germans use, and we would need hundreds of them. The industrial capacity does not exist. Captain Yuki Nakamura, a brilliant young aeronautical engineer from Kawasaki Heavy Industries, offered equally discouraging analysis of fighter performance. To intercept effectively at 9,000 meters, we need pressurized cockpits, supercharged engines optimized for high altitude, and oxygen systems far superior to what we currently field. The Americans have been developing high-altitude technology for years. We are years behind, and the gap is widening. Yamamoto listened to each presentation, taking meticulous notes. When his turn came to speak, he stood before the assembled officers and engineers with a large diagram showing the comparative capabilities of Japanese and American aircraft. Gentlemen, We must confront an uncomfortable truth. The B-29 is the product of an industrial and technological system we cannot match. Each aircraft requires approximately 600,000 man-hours to produce. It contains innovations in metallurgy, engine design, pressurization, and fire control that represent the culmination of America's entire aviation industry working in concert. He pointed to specific details on his diagram. Consider the engines alone. The Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone produces 2,200 horsepower per engine. That is 4 engines generating nearly 9,000 horsepower total, more than twice the power of our heaviest bomber. The fuel injection, turbocharging, and cooling systems represent engineering solutions to problems we are still trying to understand. An older engineer, Dr. Kenji Sato, raised his hand. Lieutenant Yamamoto, are you suggesting we cannot develop countermeasures? No, sir. I am suggesting that any effective countermeasure requires resources and time we may not have. However, there may be tactical approaches worth exploring. Yamamoto flipped to a new page of calculations. The B-29's greatest strength is also a constraint. It requires enormous quantities of fuel, must operate from specially prepared bases, and depends on complex logistics. If we can attack these vulnerabilities, the bases, the supply chains, the maintenance infrastructure, we might achieve what our interceptors cannot. The discussions continued for hours, exploring every possible angle. Some proposed suicide ramming tactics, though Yamamoto pointed out that even this desperate measure required reaching the target aircraft, which remained problematic. Others suggested night interception, but the B-29's sophisticated navigation equipment gave it significant advantages in darkness. What emerged from these sessions was not a solution, but rather a sobering assessment of Japan's strategic position. The B-29 represented American industrial might made manifest, a weapon system that could project power across vast distances with impunity, grinding down Japanese military capacity through sustained bombardment. One evening, after a particularly exhausting session, Yamamoto stood outside the facility looking up at the star-filled sky. Sergeant Ishida joined him, offering a cigarette that Yamamoto declined. "What are you thinking, sir?" Ishida asked. "I am thinking about what Captain Nakamura said today," Yamamoto replied quietly. "That we are fighting an enemy who can afford to perfect a weapon over years of development, who can produce them in quantities we cannot match, and who can deliver them from bases thousands of kilometers away. I am thinking about what this means for everything we were told about the war." Chapter 3. The Reality of Fire. On the night of March 9, 1945, Yamamoto experienced firsthand the full measure of what the B-29 could deliver. He was conducting an inspection of damage from previous raids when the sirens began their wail across Tokyo. This time, however, the circumstances were different in ways that became immediately apparent. The bombers came in low, barely 2,000 meters, under cover of darkness. Yamamoto's trained ear detected the change in engine pitch immediately. These aircraft were not making a precision daylight raid on military targets. They were coming for the city itself. The first incendiaries fell on the Shitamachi district, the densely packed working-class neighborhoods of eastern Tokyo. Within minutes, individual fires merged into a conflagration that defied comprehension. Yamamoto watched from a rooftop observation post as the flames created their own weather system, generating winds that howled through the streets at hurricane force. "They are using the wind," Yamamoto said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the firestorm. "The meteorologists predicted strong winds from the northwest tonight. The Americans knew this. They are using nature itself as a weapon." The tactical shift was devastating in its effectiveness. By attacking from low altitude at night, the B-29 sacrificed their advantage in untouchability for devastating accuracy with incendiary weapons. The resulting firestorm killed more people in a single night than any previous bombing raid in history. Estimates would later suggest over 100,000 dead, with millions left homeless. Yamamoto spent the next 3 days in the burned-out districts, documenting the destruction with the same methodical precision he applied to technical analysis. What he saw tested the limits of his ability to remain professionally detached. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash. Bodies lay in canals where people had sought refuge from the flames, only to die from heat or smoke inhalation. The sweet, terrible smell of burned flesh permeated everything. But it was the psychological impact that struck him most profoundly. The myth of invulnerability. The belief that Japan's divine protection would somehow prevail against material odds had been incinerated along with the Shitamachi district. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, their faces blank with shock, their faith in victory replaced by grim determination simply to survive. He met a young woman named Akiko Tanaka, a factory worker who had lost her entire family in the raid. She was sitting on the foundation stones of what had been her home, methodically sorting through ashes for anything salvageable. Her hands were bandaged, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes remained dry, shock having carried her beyond tears. "They told us we were winning," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. "They told us that American weakness would collapse, that our spirit would prevail. But those bombers, they came and burned everything. Where was the divine wind? Where were our fighters?" Yamamoto had no answer. Technical explanations about altitude performance and industrial capacity seemed obscene in the face of such loss. He simply bowed deeply and moved on, carrying her words with him like a weight. In the weeks following the Great Tokyo Air Raid, Yamamoto compiled a comprehensive report that made its way through military channels despite, or perhaps because of, its unflinching assessment. He documented not just the physical destruction, but the operational sophistication of the American attack, the weather analysis, the timing, the systematic approach that maximized destruction while minimizing risk to the bombers. "The enemy has demonstrated complete air superiority over the home islands," he wrote in his conclusion. "Their ability to choose the time, place, and method of attack at will represents a strategic situation without precedent in modern warfare. Furthermore, their willingness to employ incendiary weapons against civilian population centers indicates a commitment to total war that exceeds previous assumptions about American strategy." Colonel Tanaka, now promoted to general and assigned to the Army General Staff, called Yamamoto to his office after reading the report. The older man looked as though he had aged a decade in the past few months. The strain of defending the indefensible etched deeply into his features. "Your report is accurate, Lieutenant. It is also dangerous," Tanaka said carefully. "There are those who believe such assessments damage morale, that acknowledging the enemy's capabilities constitutes defeatism." "With respect, General, defeatism is a luxury of those who have not walked through the ashes of Shitamachi," Yamamoto replied. "The people know what I have documented. They have experienced it themselves. Pretending otherwise does not change reality. It only ensures we cannot adapt to it." Tanaka nodded slowly. "You are correct, of course. But adaptation requires options, and our options narrow with each passing week. The B-29 raids continue with increasing intensity. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. Every major city is burning. Our fighter forces are depleted. Our anti-aircraft ammunition is rationed, and the Americans add new air bases in the Marianas with each passing month." "Then what remains?" Yamamoto asked. "Endurance, documentation, ensuring that someone survives to learn from what we have experienced." Tanaka met Yamamoto's eyes directly. "You have the mind of an engineer. Lieutenant, continue documenting everything you observe about the B-29 and American tactics. This knowledge may prove valuable in ways we cannot currently foresee." Chapter 4. Lessons Written in Smoke. By summer 1945, Yamamoto's role had evolved into something between technical observer and historian of defeat. He traveled to bombed cities across Japan, documenting the evolution of American tactics and the devastating effectiveness of strategic bombing. Each raid revealed new innovations: radar-guided bombing through clouds, coordinated attacks from multiple directions, systematic destruction of transportation networks. The B-29s had become almost routine in their terrible efficiency. They flew their missions with the regularity of scheduled trains. and Japanese defenses had largely given up the pretense of meaningful resistance. Fighter interceptions became increasingly rare, as fuel shortages and pilot losses mounted. Anti-aircraft guns fell silent for lack of ammunition. The Silver Giants ruled the skies unchallenged. In Hiroshima, on August 6th, Yamamoto was conducting interviews with survivors of previous raids when a single B-29 appeared over the city at high altitude. The lack of accompanying bombers suggested a reconnaissance mission, or perhaps a limited strike. What happened next would forever change Yamamoto's understanding of warfare and technology. The single bomb that fell from the Enola Gay released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of conventional explosives. The resulting fireball and shockwave obliterated the city center instantaneously, killing tens of thousands in a fraction of a second. Yamamoto, positioned several kilometers from ground zero, was knocked unconscious by the blast wave. When he awoke, he found himself in a landscape that defied comprehension. Buildings had been vaporized. People had been reduced to shadows burned into concrete. A weapon that exceeded every previous conception of destructive power had been employed with clinical precision, and its implications were immediately clear even through the shock and horror. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. Japan's surrender followed within days, though Yamamoto would spend the next week in a medical facility being treated for radiation exposure. He did not yet understand. In September, as American occupation forces began arriving, Yamamoto was among the Japanese technical personnel selected to meet with U.S. Army Air Force's intelligence officers. The Americans wanted to understand Japanese perceptions of the B-29 campaign, and Yamamoto's detailed documentation had come to their attention. The interview took place in a commandeered office building in Tokyo, conducted by Major Robert Harrison, a soft-spoken intelligence officer from Ohio who spoke passable Japanese. Harrison treated Yamamoto with professional courtesy, offering coffee and cigarettes before beginning his questions. "Lieutenant Yamamoto, we have reviewed your technical reports on B-29 operations. Your analysis is remarkably thorough and objective," Harrison said. "I would like to understand, from your perspective as both an engineer and an observer, what impact the B-29 had on Japanese strategy and morale." Yamamoto considered his response carefully, aware that honesty served no strategic purpose now but might serve historical understanding. "Major Harrison, the B-29 fundamentally altered the strategic equation of the Pacific War. It projected American industrial power directly onto the Japanese homeland in ways our military could not effectively counter. This had psychological effects that exceeded the physical destruction, though that was devastating enough." "Can you elaborate on the psychological aspects?" Harrison asked, taking notes. "Japanese military doctrine emphasized spirit, determination, and willingness to sacrifice as force multipliers against material superiority," Yamamoto explained. The B-29 rendered these factors largely irrelevant. No amount of determination could prevent the raids. No sacrifice could reach aircraft operating at 9,000 meters. This created a sense of helplessness that undermined faith in ultimate victory more effectively than any propaganda could have achieved. Harrison nodded, then asked a more pointed question. "When did you personally conclude that Japan could not win the war?" Yamamoto was silent for a long moment, remembering that first raid in November 1944, watching the Silver Giants fly untouched across Tokyo's sky. "I think I understood the mathematical reality the first time I saw B-29s bomb Tokyo from 30,000 feet. Everything afterward was confirmation of that initial assessment. But understanding reality and accepting its implications are different things. Perhaps I truly accepted it only in Hiroshima." The conversation continued for hours, ranging across technical details, tactical innovations, and strategic implications. Harrison proved to be well-informed and genuinely curious about Japanese perspectives. As the interview concluded, he made an observation that stayed with Yamamoto. "Lieutenant, warfare has always been about applying resources to achieve strategic objectives. What the B-29 represented was America's ability to develop and deploy a weapon system that operated beyond the reach of Japanese defenses. It was not invulnerable. We lost many aircraft and crews, but it was effective enough to achieve strategic objectives without prohibitive cost. That calculation, more than any single battle, determined the war's outcome. Years later, after the occupation ended and Japan began its long reconstruction, Yamamoto would write a comprehensive technical history of the B-29 campaign over Japan. His work, combining engineering analysis with first-hand observation, would become a standard reference for military historians studying strategic bombing. In his introduction, he wrote, "The B-29 superfortress was more than an aircraft. It was a manifestation of American industrial and technological capability. Its ability to bomb Japan from altitudes our defenses could not reach represented not a temporary tactical advantage, but a fundamental disparity in national capacity. Understanding this weapon system requires understanding the society that produced it, one capable of investing years and vast resources into developing solutions to complex engineering challenges, then manufacturing those solutions at scale." The stunned reaction of Japanese defenders when B-29s first appeared over Tokyo at 30,000 feet reflected not simple surprise, but the sudden realization that we faced an opponent operating on a different technological level entirely. The manuscript included thousands of technical drawings, performance calculations, and operational analyses, but it also contained something rarer, an honest accounting of what it meant to be on the receiving end of overwhelming technological superiority, and how that experience shaped understanding of modern warfare. On quiet evenings, Yamamoto would sometimes stand outside his modest home in reconstructed Tokyo and look up at the sky. Commercial airliners traced white contrails across the blue, flying at altitudes that had once seemed impossibly high. The memory of those first silver giants remained vivid, not as a source of bitterness, but as a reminder of the terrible efficiency with which industrial power could be projected across great distances. The B-29 had taught Japan painful lessons about modern warfare, written in fire and smoke across every major city. Those lessons, Yamamoto believed, must be preserved and understood, not to refight old battles but to ensure that the price paid for learning them was not forgotten. Understanding the weapon that had stunned Japanese defenders with its altitude and capability was understanding the nature of total war itself, a lesson as relevant to future generations as it had been devastating to his own.